Hello, everybody. My name is Gilda Ross. I'm the Glenbard Student and Community Projects Coordinator. A very busy night in the western suburbs, but I happen to know about some people that are organizing viewing parties, moms getting together to listen, to learn about work, parent, thrive. And we're so fortunate to have Yael Schonbrun back again with us for the second time. It's a real treat. We thank all the sponsors who make this possible. We thank you. We couldn't do it without both of these organizations, both of these people. And most importantly, we do want everyone to know that this is for everyone. So please do share this resource with friends and colleagues, family members across the country, next door. Everyone's always welcome. Quickly, what is upcoming with the Glenbard Parent Series? Next week, we have an important program. It's our first time that we are going to be welcoming Bruce Perry. He and Oprah Winfrey wrote a book together called What Happened to You? A Shift from What Is Wrong with You. The title of the program for next Wednesday at noon at 7 p.m. Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing. You don't want to miss that. And please do share, as I mentioned. This month is Bullying Prevention Month, and because of that, we're welcoming an expert, Dr. Samir Handuja. He has written several books on this topic, and the topic of the program the night he's with us is confronting cyberbullying and careless, unwise social media use in tech-savvy kids. That is Wednesday, October 18th at noon at 7 p.m. And then as November comes along, we'll be welcoming Sasha Long. She'll be talking with the topic Can't Do or Won't Do about executive functional skill building to solve behavior challenges. She'll be speaking for an hour and then 30 minutes added on workshop for parents of neurodiverse children. So that it should be a special treat on November 1st, noon and 7 p.m. We are welcoming Dr. Shauna Shapiro back to the Glenbard Parent Series. She has a new book, Violet, I Love You, for those parents of children in the young years. We'll learn about mindfulness and growing calm and joy in young children. We're also very excited about Mitch Prinstein, Eva Telzer talking about social media and teen mental health. And also coming up is Dr. Ken Ginsberg, who will be here talking about his new book, Congratulations, You're Having a Teen. Lots to write on the calendar, so I appreciate that. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the principal of Glenbard West, Ben Peterselli, who has the honors of introducing tonight's speaker. Take it away, Ben.
Thank you, Gilda, and good evening, everyone. I am Ben Peterselli, principal of Glenbard West High School. I'm thrilled to be introducing Yael Schonbrun for tonight's Glenbard Parent Series presentation. Dr. Schonbrun is a clinical psychologist, podcaster, and assistant professor at Brown University. She's the author of a highly regarded book, Work, Parent, Thrive, 12 Science-Backed Strategies to Ditch Guilt, Manage Overwhelm, and Grow Connection When Everything Feels Like Too Much. In her private practice and writing, Dr. Schonbrun uses evidence-based science to help individuals and couples learn to manage work, parenting, and marriage in more effective and fulfilling ways. Her writing often appears in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other high-profile media outlets. And we are thrilled to welcome her today to today's important GPS conversation. Welcome, Dr. Schonbrun.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here and so grateful to Gilda for putting this together and you, Ben, for hosting me. So thank you very much. And I have to admit that my children are in the background, so you may hear them here and there. And that will just make this talk more rich because we're bringing the real life into art comes to life kind of a thing. And if you're like me, you probably had to move mountains to get here tonight. And so it's probably a very apt talk to be talking about how our work and our family lives can sometimes crash into each other. And as a clinical psychologist, as a parent, as somebody who is ambitious in my professional life, but who is very committed to family life, this has been a topic that's been near and dear to my heart and something that I didn't actually expect to be talking about and studying and diving into the science about until I became a working parenthood. My history is actually as a relationship specialist. Early in my career was a researcher who studied marital therapy for couples and also specialize in that clinically. And so I look at the world from a very relational standpoint, but I never thought about the way that our roles relate to one another until I became a parent. And I have, very vivid memories, as many of us do, from those early days of kind of that overwhelm, like deer in the headlights experience of feeling so enamored with my little baby and so unsure about what I was doing and so committed to the work life that I'd worked so hard to build and so uncertain about how I was going to carry it forward now that my heart was kind of split in two. And I have memories of driving to work and weeping the whole way because the commute was really hard with a baby. I commuted from Boston to Providence with a baby in tow and, feeling just all torn up when I left him at daycare to go sit at my desk and write grants, and then really guilty and kind of ashamed of myself as a professional for being at home at night with him and not carrying on with the grant work and the writing and the research that I knew all of my colleagues were doing at night. And so I started really thinking about, what is missing here? Because if somebody like me who has a healthy child and enjoyable professional life and supportive colleagues and a terrific partner is struggling as much as I am, there must be something wrong. And so I started reading everything I could get my hands on from the bookstore and the library. And most of what I saw there had a focus on what was going on outside of the human mind and body in our social structures, in the world around us. But as a clinical psychologist, and specifically somebody who's interested in relationship between things, historically in my research that had been between people, I started thinking about the relationship between roles and the complexity that exists therein. And I started diving into the scientific literature on it. And what I found there was actually really interesting and forms the crux of this book, Work, Parent, Thrive, that we're going to be talking about today. And what I found there, and that I'll share with you tonight, is that there is a conflict between our roles, but that there's a lot more complexity to it and some really positivity, some real positive elements that we tend to overlook because we are so focused on exploring and really experiencing the conflict between them. But we're going to talk about a much richer, more interesting and more positive picture tonight. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share some slides here. All right, so again, we're going to be talking about Work, Parent, Thrive, how to ditch guilt, manage overwhelm, and grow connection when everything feels like too much, because goodness knows, most of the time, everything feels like too much. Again, if you're like me, probably tonight felt like too much, and probably you weren't sure if you were going to make it tonight. But here we are. And if you're watching this as a recording, you must have made time in your schedule to do it. And kudos to you, because it's not easy to do when you exist in a life that has multiple demanding roles. Time is always pressed, and we always have more things that we need to do than we have the space and the energy and the attention to get done. So what we're going to talk about tonight is rethinking the relationship between our most demanding roles. Again, we tend to think only about the conflict between them, and this is an important element and certainly something we experience on a day-to-day basis. But we're going to start to expand out a little bit, and this is what my work really focuses on. And once we've sort of engaged in a mental shift and starting to think about it differently, we can use a social science to guide ourselves in acting differently day to day. And once we act differently, we also have an opportunity to change how we feel about it and to use social science to guide how we foster positivity and more success, which is certainly more enjoyable. So we're going to cover all of these topics. And this is just a little bit of a roadmap. Again, we're talking about the cognitive piece, the behavioral piece, and then the emotional piece. All right, so for those of us that have access to chat, it's always fun to kind of just brainstorm, kind of throw out whatever words you can think of. What words come to mind when you think about straddling multiple roles? What are sort of the main words that crop up? Push, pull, right? So like a tension between them. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the time I hear people say things like inadequate or impossible or juggling, frustrating. Yeah. For most people, what we think about when we think about the tension between roles, it's like negative words. Push, pull, frustrating, impossible, inadequate, exhausting, untenable, insurmountable. Tug of war, right? And that's kind of the general experience that people have. And that makes sense because work-family conflict really is a public health concern. It's something that people who participate in multiple demanding roles feel on a day-to-day basis. And parents feel an increasing level of pressure year by year. And even though remote technology is supposed to kind of make things easier and more flexible, it can actually cause problems because now we're available all the time to all of our roles, right? Our work can access us, our clients can access us 24 hours a day. Even when we're at work, our kids can access us if they have a phone, or we can video into their preschools and find out what's happening all the time. So we never get a break from any role, even though it's supposed to be for the purposes of flexibility. Gender inequality is something that really hits women quite hard, especially once they become parents. And workplace inflexibility has been a reality for a long time. And I do think that since the pandemic, workplaces have had to get more flexible. But again, there's sort of this double-edged sword of that flexibility, meaning that we're often available all the time and we never have an actual break. And then, of course, there's the atrocious social policy where maternity and paternity leave is quite limited in America and makes it very, very hard for people to kind of get back into the workspace after having a child. And so it's no wonder that we feel that negativity about the tension between roles. But here's the thing. Work-family conflict is just a part of the picture. And what I'm going to talk about today is sort of a rethinking from what we currently tend to talk about in the work-family conflict conversation, which is a more fixed pie ideology. This idea that there's only so many resources available, there's only so much time, there's only so much energy, there's only so much attention that we have. And if one of our roles is capturing some of those resources, it means it's taking away from the other role. So it's this kind of competition or a scarcity mindset. And what we're going to talk about today is what is called an expandable pie ideology. And I like to represent that as the yin-yang symbol. It's the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. In other words, that our roles, while we kind of tend to think about them as being in opposition to one another, are actually quite complementary in a variety of ways that we're going to dive into tonight. For example, I was just thinking about the example as I was getting ready tonight of, on the one hand, it's kind of a shame that I am working tonight because I don't see my nighttime is usually when I spend time with my kids, but also I get a night off of putting them to bed. So I was just thinking about that as being like sum is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of its parts for me in this evening. But the idea, and I'm teasing a little bit about that, but we will talk about how our roles actually enrich each other. And there's kind of three distinct pathways that I tend to think about enrichment happening. And these pathways emerged from qualitative analyses that I did with dozens and dozens of working parents. I analyzed transcripts of interviews where I asked people, in what ways do your roles help each other out? And there are sort of like three pockets, but everybody has their own specific way. So as I'm talking this through, what I hope people do is start to think and reflect on what are the ways that your multiple roles help each other out. And sometimes we got to dig a little deep because it doesn't feel particularly obvious. And the reason that doesn't feel particularly obvious is that we don't tend to think in this way. We more tend to think about the ways that our roles take away from each other. So this is a pretty different way of thinking. And it is very similar to the shift from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset, which most parents have heard of. But it's this idea that we can be acculturated to think about talents or skills as being fixed, right? That we either are good at math or we're not good at math. And if we're brought up thinking that that's how math skills work, it's sort of surprising to us to discover that actually where we start is not where we have to end. That with math skills and pretty much any other kind of skill, you can learn and you can grow, but it really helps to have a growth mindset in order to do that. Because when we have a fixed mindset, when we believe it's predetermined, ingrained from the get-go, then we tend not to look for opportunities to build upon it. And so the fixed mindset ends up being a self-fulfilling prophecy. Whereas if we foster a growth mindset, we create more opportunities to shift. And so once we start to think about these pathways of enrichment as being available to us, we start to experience more opportunities for enrichment to happen. So the transfer effect is the idea that when we step out of one role and into another, we're often developing skills or doing something that can feed back into the role that we've stepped away from. So let me use the example of stepping into parenting and away from work. When I step into parenting and away from work, I'm often talking with my kids. My youngest is 6, and he's telling me stories, and I have to do a lot of perspective taking. He likes to tie his shoes all by himself, so I got to be super patient to get out the door. They often want things that I don't want, so there's a lot of negotiation. And those interpersonal skills feed really well into most workplaces, certainly into mine because I'm a psychologist, but for most people, those kinds of interpersonal skills that our kids help us to build are actually quite helpful. Now, for most people in our workspace, we're developing specific kinds of skills, whether you're in the service industry, whether you do something that requires technology or artistic capacities. Those are skills that actually help you to teach your kids specialized skills. They also teach our kids to be responsible, right? Because we're modeling doing a job, we're modeling showing up for our colleagues and for our clients. We're also having practice in identifying projects that need to be taken from start to finish, and that helps us to teach our kids those kinds of skills. So that's the transfer effect, that whatever role that we're in, we're often honing skills that can feed back in really positive, advantageous ways to the role that we've stepped away from. The stress buffer effect has to do with the fact that in all of our roles, we have moments and phases of time where things are more stressful than others. So for example, if your child is going through a developmental phase that's really tough, like the toddler years or the teenage years, going to work can offer a reprieve from the stress. And vice versa. Sometimes work gets really stressful and we're having a phase where we're just not feeling particularly successful. And on those days or in those phases, we can go home and get hugs from our kids or our partner and find an opportunity to have a positive experience, even if one of our roles is predominantly feeling kind of negative. So that's the stress buffer effect. Finally, the additive effect comes from the idea that psychology researchers have really confirmed that happier lives tend to be more full of meaning and purpose. And when our meaning and purpose is restricted to one narrow area of our life, it becomes a little fragile, because if all of my sense of purpose is in my role as a professional, then the day where I have a failure, I'm going to really feel a lack of purpose or a lack of meaning. Same thing goes with our kids, right? As our kids age, if all of our meaning and our purpose is from being a parent, when our kids go off into the world, we can feel a real deficit, a real sense of loss. And it sort of helps us to spread our existential eggs into lots of different baskets if we have multiple roles from which to extract a sense of meaning and purpose. So that's the additive effect. So as I talk through some of the ways that work-life enrichment can emerge, I want you to be thinking about these 3 distinct pathways: the transfer effect, the buffer effect, and the additive effect. And once we start in our own lives looking for opportunities to access enrichment, to savor it, to foster it, we can enjoy these effects all the more. And what I found actually, which was really fun, is although I wasn't intending to do interventions with people that I was interviewing for the book project, it ended up being the case that when I asked people to tell me a little bit about how their various roles helped one another out, enriched each other and enriched the people and their families and their workspaces, it was really surprising and hard for them to kind of think in that way. But once I kind of pushed, like, no, how does your job as a restaurateur help you as a parent? And how does your parenting help you as a teacher or a lawyer or an engineer? That people were able to come up with ideas and ways. And then it started to kind of ripple out. And what people would tell me much later after the interview had been conducted is, now that they were thinking in this way of work-family enrichment, the enrichment experiences were much more available to them, because once you start to see it, you begin to see it everywhere. So knowing that it exists helps you to notice it more, and then knowing what to do helps you to access it more and to make those experiences even more potent. So this is why we're going to talk about the behavioral piece, because there are actual strategies that social science teaches us that helps us to really foster that enrichment, to foster that complementary nature, to foster the ways that the tension between our roles can help each of our roles out and can help us as individuals out too. So we're going to talk about this in a few different areas. We're going to talk about it in terms of fostering creativity, in terms of helping us rethink rest, because goodness knows working parents need more rest than we actually get, in managing our overwhelm, and then also in our ability to tend to our happiness. So I'm going to start with the story of a neuroscientist, Dr. Felice Dunn, who studies the eye, who studies the perception of, who studies vision. She was actually an artist very early on in her life, so a very creative person. And then in college, discovered this love of science and specifically in sort of deconstructing how we see the world. And she became a part of a team that made an enormous discovery when she was just in her second year of college. So for those of you who went to college in the 1990s, you might have heard about two different photoreceptors. One is cones and the other is rods. But in the 90s, researchers discovered a third kind of photoreceptor, but they didn't really know what it did. And Felice was a part of the team that conducted groundbreaking research and discovered what this photoreceptor did, what this new photoreceptor that nobody had ever detected before did. And what it did was it detected circadian light. And the way that Felice always did her work was focused, hours and hours in the lab, morning till night, 7 days a week. And she was very creative, but her creativity came from just grunt work, her ability to sweat it out and commit to it. So it was no surprise, because she had been very successful early in life, that she landed a fabulous position at UCSF, one of the premier research institutions. She started a lab. She was grant funded, doing terrific work, having postdocs that she was guiding in their training. When she finally decided she thought it was time to start a family, she had been on the fence because she was so committed to her work and to her creative life that she wasn't sure she had time or space to have a family, but decided that she thought that she could manage it. But when she had her son, everything kind of fell apart. She told me, I had an identity crisis. Everything that I had so carefully built fell apart because I couldn't do my work in the way that I had been accustomed to doing it. And I also wasn't comfortable never being around to parent my child. And so she really faced a dilemma. And what she ended up doing, and she did this kind of naturally and was sort of surprised when I was sharing with her the research that kind of confirmed that some of the strategies that she had naturally come to are ones that social science shows are quite effective, because with less time, we can activate other creativity processes that are pretty nifty. And we can, when we know that they exist, use them in very deliberate ways. So the first is that we can use incompatible roles to get fresh perspectives. This goes to the Buddhist idea of the beginner's mind that, at least in the work to parenting direction, that sometimes when we step away from work and get involved with our kids, we see things from a fresh perspective, because our kids, everything is new to them, right? It's sort of like that Proust quote of a voyage with new eyes, right? We get down on their level and the world looks kind of different. I often think about this as kind of the idea of like, if you're all bored with your dinner recipes and you go to the supermarket with your child and you get on their level, sometimes you'll see items in the grocery store that you never thought of cooking with before. It gives you a fresh perspective. And we can use our work to give us a fresh perspective on parenting too. For example, by looking at a colleague who's really good at dealing with a difficult client and wondering if those kinds of strategies can be useful with our toddler. So we can use our incompatible roles to get fresh perspectives on problems, to get creative insights on how to navigate challenges in novel ways. Another way is to use role tension to prompt non-conscious creative processes. And how this works, and most people have heard of the Archimedes effect, the Eureka effect. It's this legend that is probably more fiction than fact, where Archimedes was in the bath when he had a Eureka moment and he figured out why buoyancy happened. Now, Archimedes had been working on this problem for a long time, but it was when he stepped away from the problem that the insight arrived. It's a lot like when you have a fight with your partner and you're trying to think of the perfect comeback and it just doesn't arrive. And then several hours later, when you're in the shower, all of a sudden, it comes to you. Now, what's happening there is actually a neurological process that happens in a part of your brain called the default mode network. And this is the part of your brain that is gets active when you're not consciously focused. It's kind of the mind-wandering part of your brain. It's where divergent thinking happens, where unconnected ideas can get connected because your mind is kind of wandering around. And so now what Felice does is when she's stuck on a problem and she has to go home, she allows herself to stop thinking about it, to be on the floor playing with her now 2 children. And often she discovers that it's when she has stepped away from a problem that she's really been thinking hard about, that the insights kind of almost magically arrive for her. And we can, again, do this very deliberately by mindfully stepping away from problems at the end of a day and actually appreciating the boundaries on when we can spend time on a problem and the pressure to step away as an opportunity to activate these non-conscious processes. And so much of the science that I talk about here is really effective in achieving the goal, but the sort of side effect too, and I always like to point this out, is that it's very helpful in helping us to alleviate the guilt, the toxic guilt that often surrounds the fact that working parents can't be only at work and we can't only be parenting. Because what we discover is actually that the balance of roles and the tension that exists between them and the pressure to not be available all the time fundamentally serves each of our roles pretty well. And by recognizing the benefits, it allows us to kind of let go of the guilt, because actually we're doing a good job by stepping away from work. We're able to bring a more creative self back because we have ended our day and moved into a different role. This is true for rest too. And this is one of the most important questions that I often get asked about, and something that I used to struggle with a lot. As a parent of 3, right now my kids are 6, 10, and 13, but especially when they were very young, I was exhausted all the time. And as somebody who holds a couple of jobs, it was really hard for me to sort of navigate my own fatigue levels and all the demands that I had. And what used to drive me absolutely bananas was when people would say, you know what you really need? You need to unplug and go on a meditation retreat, because that sounded awesome, but I just wasn't able to do that. I don't have family that lives in town. I don't have a partner with a flexible job. I don't have the financial means to just off and go. And I also don't have the constitution to not feel super guilty about that anyway. And so going on a vacation to unplug and recharge simply wasn't something that was available to me. And it used to irritate me that people would really hone in on that one way to rest, because actually there's a lot of ways to rest. And if we can sort of figure out how to rethink rest, we can make it more available to us. And the strategy that we're going to talk about has to do with turning off each role in turn. So rather than sort of unplugging entirely, which is very useful if you can do it, and I do think that vacations are great, but we need something that's a little bit more regular and a little bit more available for those of us that have multiple demanding roles that are hard to step fully away from all at the same time. And so the term that social scientists have for this turning off is something called psychological detachment. And it basically just means that in each role that you have, what's important is not necessarily to turn everything off, but it's to turn each role off in a very deliberate, full way. So when you're not working, you don't keep your phone on and check the Slack channel and the email. You put the phone away. You have to sort of fully step away from it. When you leave your kids at daycare or drop them off at school, the psychological detachment looks like not checking the school emails and not watching the video in the preschool, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to turn off the parenting part of yourself so that that part of you can rest. And that's important because when we are so busy, that psychological detachment is how we can recharge the battery that belongs to each of our roles. And the way that we can do that when we are so busy is to actually take advantage of the pressure between our roles to force us, or to, maybe force is not quite the right word, but to really press us to engage in that very full psychological detachment, again, from each role in turn. And what that can look like is pretty surprising. And one of my favorite studies to share on this topic comes from a study out of Israel that followed Israeli army reservists. It followed employees at an Israeli company, half of whom were army reservists. And during the course of this study, the half of the participants who were Army reservists were called into active duty. And the researchers followed them. They were looking at work burnout, and they were looking at what happened with experiences of work burnout among these employees and comparing those that stayed working versus those that went off to war. Literally, these Army reservists were in active war duty. And what they found is that the folks who went and engaged in active duty experienced less burnout than those that remained working for the duration of the study. And the reason is that those who went into active duty were able to engage in psychological detachment in a more full, deliberate way. And that is because they simply were not available to their jobs. And if we can see going to war as an opportunity to reduce burnout, we can see the tension between our roles as an opportunity to really push for psychological detachment from each of our roles in turn. And for a lot of parents, you can think about this even like when your kids are really young and you're worried about their developmental milestones and whether they're sleeping and, what the next food that you're going to introduce is. When you go to work, you are focused on what you're doing at your job. And so you get to sort of rest the part of your brain that is constantly consumed with the worries of your children. And for some of us, because the worries are so pervasive, it can really help to be very mindful of like, when I'm at work, I'm going to be at work. I'm going to try to continue, repeatedly bring my mind back to work in sort of like a meditation-like fashion. Like, now I'm going to be working. Now I'm going to be working. And the same thing goes when we're in our parenting role. We can actively bring ourselves back into the moment with our kids and really try in an active way to put our job stressors, our work worries to the side. And again, this can help us with the guilt because what we're doing in that moment is we're allowing the parts of ourselves that really feel urgency to get something done or to sort of be present to rest so that when we return to those roles, we have more energy to give them. And so we can really use role pressure to our advantage to turn different parts of ourselves off so that we can recoup some of our energy. So again, while I think that beachside vacations are something to strive for, and I certainly aim to, engaging this practice of psychological detachment can be really useful. All right, so now we're going to talk about managing overwhelm. And one of the things that happens with overwhelm and people who have too many roles is like, we just have so much on our plate. Like, I don't know what you folks in the audience had to do today, but I went from, making breakfast and lunches for my kids, taking them to school. Then I had some patients. Then I had some writing tasks and deadlines. Then I had a meeting with my writing agent. Then I had a talk that I gave. Then I had a meeting with some colleagues. Then I had to go get my kids from sports practice, make their dinner. And, I certainly have a partner and a lot of help from childcare providers, but there's a lot of things that I'm juggling throughout the day. There's just so much, and it always feels like there's more that you should be doing. And, part of that is the social pressure that we have of our parenting friends who sign their kids up for all the things and the things that our kids want to do and the work ambitions that we have and the pressures that we have from our work. So we can see the value of a less busy schedule, of a schedule that doesn't involve tons of chauffeuring and cooking and deadlines and people that we have responsibilities to. But it's really hard to see how we get there. It's kind of like the clean closet. We can see the value of it. We see the picture, but we're like, I don't even know when I would have the time. And if I get rid of those jeans, maybe I'll want them later. And then when I go shopping and the one thing that, lots of people do is like, you see the full closet, and what do we do instead of getting rid of stuff? We go to the container store and we buy containers to try to organize it, which just means we have more stuff in our closet. And what it turns out to be true is that this is a way that the human brain is actually wired. We're wired to add, not to subtract. And this is a terrific book that I really, really love. And it's based on a fascinating body of research that was conducted by Leidy Klotz and some of his colleagues over at the University of Virginia, where they found that when people were given options between adding or subtracting in design choices, even when subtracting was the clear, better choice, people often defaulted to adding. So when we're trying to make a choice about making something better, whether it's a soup recipe, whether it's a golf course, whether it's an itinerary, whether it's a graph symmetricity, the tendency that people have, and this was captured in the title of their research paper, is that people systematically overlook subtraction, even when it's the better choice. And what's so useful about recognizing that is that it helps us to be more deliberate. So we have this idea that getting to less, getting to simpler, getting to less cluttered in our day-to-day lives should be the easier thing to do. But actually, it takes more effort because our brain is not naturally wired to think about taking things off our plate, right? It's sort of like you go through Target and you're feeling kind of stressed out, and you're much more likely to put stuff that you don't need in your cart than if you're feeling calm and deliberate and thoughtful. So once we know that subtracting requires deliberate effort, and if we do want to create lives that are less overwhelming, we can develop deliberate practices. And that might look like, Leidy recommends, next to your to-do list, developing a stop doing list. So really being thoughtful about some of the things that don't feel very valuable and being very dedicated to taking them off your plate. In my private practice, I really encourage people to reflect on their values, to think about what they want their family life to look like, to what they want their work life to look like, and then to do kind of an inventory of how they're spending their days and their weeks. Where is their time going? And are the things that you're spending your time on, are the things that you're supporting your children in spending their time on, aligned with your values? And if those activities are not aligned with your values, can you consider subtracting? So it might be things, for me, it's been not doing birthday parties. I don't like birthday parties. I don't like hosting them. I don't like the party favors. I don't like all the thank you notes. It just feels like a huge commitment of time and energy and resources that doesn't feel very value aligned. I would rather just do something with my kids. And so in my family, we're pretty limited in both in hosting birthday parties and even in attending birthday parties. That's just something we've decided as a family is not super aligned with our values. For the most part, we have some flexibility around it. But I think, things like social media or meetings that feel a little gratuitous, like you're not getting a lot out of them. And so if they are optional, can you opt out? Things like activities that, your kids are not super into, that the neighbors are doing, but don't feel particularly value aligned. So kind of do an inventory with this idea of getting curious about what you want to stand for and what you want to spend your time on. And again, with that awareness that subtracting requires deliberate effort. And the other thing that you can do is really recognize that role tension exists to kind of remind you that not everything is important. Because if everything is important, then really nothing is important. So use that tension, that pressure, that sense of overwhelm to prompt you to do this kind of questioning of what's really important and what is less important and therefore might be under consideration to subtract. All right, so now we're going to turn to talking a little bit about emotional life. And what I always like to start with is this idea that plants need a few key ingredients to thrive. Those ingredients are sunlight, water, and minerals, right? It's pretty simple. And we know that when a plant has those three things in the right balance, that they tend to do pretty well. Well, it turns out that humans are not that different, that we have psychological nutrients that we need, and we need to get them regularly in order to thrive. And when we don't get the psychological nutrients that are core to human thriving, we tend to wither, just like plants. And this comes from a theory called self-determination theory that's been studied for decades and decades and has been really well proven. And what we know is that those psychological nutrients fall into three categories, and they are experiences of agency. So this is the idea that all humans really hunger for a sense of autonomy, like a volitional choice, like I get to have some agency over what I do or what I don't do. The second key nutrient is a sense of competency. So that's like, I feel like I can do this. I have mastered it. I feel comfortable and confident in my skill set. And we all hunger for that, right? And in all of our lives, We probably have areas that we don't feel pretty competent, and that's okay as long as there are some areas where we do experience some competency. So we're not looking to feel agency everywhere or competency everywhere, but it's more that we want to have some experiences that fall into that category on a regular basis. And the third one that most people are familiar with is experiences of connection, right? Humans are really social creatures. We need to feel connected. And sometimes that connection can be to other people. Sometimes it can be a sort of internal connection, and it can also be a connection to something larger than ourselves, like spirituality or a mission. But that sense of connection, something that's sort of outside of ourselves, is very meaningful. And again, when we have experiences of agency, competency, and connection, we tend to just do better. We tend to feel happier. We tend to be more successful. And what I think is so important to recognize is that while having multiple demanding roles kind of pulls us in lots of different directions, it also offers us more places to meet our core psychological needs. So for example, if you're going through a phase with your child where you're feeling not very connected because they're pushing you away, maybe your teenager doesn't want to spend as much time with you as you used to spend together, or maybe at work, you're feeling kind of isolated because your closest colleague moved to a different company. Then you can use your other roles to see if you can find opportunities for connection, right? If you're feeling isolated at work, you can go home and give your kids a hug. If you're feeling lonely at home, you can ask a work colleague out for coffee, or you can go out to dinner with your partner or a friend. Same thing goes for agency and competency. So for example, if you're feeling micromanaged at work, or if your child is engaging in dictatorial sleep routines, you can find experiences of autonomy in the other role. And again, with competency, right? If your kid is entering a new developmental milestone and you feel like, I do not know what I'm doing here, you can look to your work role or your hobbies to experience a sense of mastery. Or if you're feeling like you're entering a new phase in your professional life and you really don't know what you're doing, you can find opportunities at home to say, well, I really know how to cook dinner, or I really know how to comfort my child, and to really savor those moments where you're experiencing those psychological nutrients, and recognize that whenever you're missing one, that having more roles gives you an opportunity to get curious and ask yourself, which role could offer me this experience of agency, this experience of autonomy, or this experience of agency, this experience of competency, or this experience of connection. So what I want to end with is this idea that there's no question that lives where you're working and you're parenting or otherwise have lots of demanding roles, something gets lost, right? There is a tension between our roles, and there are finite resources. There's only 24 hours in a day. We do need to sleep for some of them. There's only so much attention that we have throughout a given day. We do get depleted by the end of it. So working parenthood is tough, and it's no wonder that we have a hard time. And I think that's important. And I always worry that it kind of gets lost in my talking about this opportunity for work-family enrichment, because what I don't want to suggest is the sense of toxic positivity. It's more of a question of how do we make space for the fact that our roles can sometimes be in conflict, or it can exist in tension, and it can be very frustrating or overwhelming or difficult. And at the same time, there's opportunities for something really positive to emerge, because involvement in many roles can serve our roles well, it can serve us well, it can serve our companies well, and it can serve our children well, because we're modeling this ability to navigate multiple demanding roles at the same time and exist in that tension and find ways to foster enrichment within that. It's a little bit like the idea of resilience, where in order to grow stronger, we need to have difficult experiences, because those are exactly what help us to develop strength. And the same thing goes for the tension that exists between roles. It is difficult, and we can grow and experience positive things in those challenges. So by learning to appreciate how our competing demands can help each of our roles and our overarching happiness, we can experience more of those of that richness. And my book dives into a lot more areas, including how we can use our multiple roles to help us manage stress more effectively, how it can help us to manage our marriages more and partnerships more effectively, how it can help us to parent more effectively. And so I hope, if you're interested, that you check the book out. You can also check out my newsletter. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, my background specialty is in relationships, in human relationships, and I've sort of expanded to the relationship between roles, but I write a bi-monthly newsletter called Relational that is all about the science and art of thriving in our relational life. So you can sign up at my website, which is workparentthrive.com. And you can also, I hope people check out my book. I'm very proud of it. It came out in November of 2022, and it's available wherever books are sold. And I love chatting with people. So if you are interested in reaching out to me, feel free to email me. I love receiving emails and talking about science and how we can thrive in our multiple demanding roles. So I think we have a little bit of time for questions if folks have any. I'm going to close down the slides.
Wonderful. I loved it. I love it. Every time I hear you, I love it. You talked about the eulogy, thinking about a eulogy. Will you talk about that?
Yes. So the eulogy exercise is an exercise that comes from an evidence-based treatment called acceptance and commitment therapy, that if folks are interested in therapy in general, it's a really interesting therapy to check out. And the podcast that I just recently retired from co-hosting, Psychologist Off the Clock, talks a lot about acceptance and commitment therapy. The eulogy exercise is an exercise that we use to help folks clarify their values. And values are defined as moment to moment what we want to stand for. It's kind of the person that you want to be in the context that you're living in, based on what's important to you and what's going on inside of you and around you. And what we do in the eulogy exercise is kind of take this zoomed out lens and ask ourselves, at our eulogy, what would we want people to talk about us? How would we want people to talk about us? What would we want the people that we love to say we stood for? So this is a way that we can sort of get clarity on what's really important and recognize what's really not important. So for example, most of us at our eulogies aren't interested in saying, well, Yael spent a lot of time on Instagram. No, but I might want people to say Yael wrote about science in a very thoughtful way, or Yael was really present in her family life, but she also really loved her work, or Yael was a really curious person. So what kinds of things would you want people to say about you at your eulogy? And asking yourself that and really reflecting deeply on it. And I really recommend that people do this as a journaling exercise, because it can really lead you to some interesting places. And what we know from research is that when we write things down, it helps us get more clear. It also helps us to be able to reflect back on it later, because some of those thoughts can kind of come and then go, and we forget what we came up with. But doing this kind of an exercise can really help you to get in touch with what is really important to you. And that can provide a really lovely compass that can guide your action, instead of just doing what other people are doing, or doing what you feel like people are pressuring you to do, which is kind of the default, because we are social creatures and we do care what other people think and what other people, how other people might be judging us. And we do want, for example, our kids to have, equal opportunities as other kids in our neighborhood, but maybe different things are important to us than are important to our neighbors. And unless we reflect on that deeply, it's going to be hard for us to connect to it enough so that we can let the values that are most important to us and inside of our families guide our choices.
Question for you. What's the most important question, or the question you get most frequently when you give this talk?
Oh, I think that the question I get most frequently is, how do working parents get rid of the guilt, particularly mothers? And I think it's one of my favorite questions, because there's a really interesting emotion science. So functional emotion researchers study why we have emotions, what emotions prompt us to do, because for all emotions, right, there's an evolutionary function to it. So I always start with talking a little bit about the evolutionary function of guilt, which is guilt is a very interpersonal emotion. It cues us when there is an anticipated harm or a harm that's been done to important relationships. And if you think about that, that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, because it was so important in pre-modern times for humans to have a certainty that they were involved in the group, right? That they wouldn't be ousted from the group. So having those emotions to cue us, like you're doing right by your tribe, was really, really important to stay connected in a positive way so that we wouldn't be pushed out of the tribe and face danger. So guilt, even today, is really important, right? We don't want to totally neglect our kids, and we don't want to totally neglect our work. And so guilt is a really important cue to the fact that you might be neglecting something that's really important. But the problem is that guilt can sometimes misfire. It's like a smoke alarm that goes off even when there's no fire at all. It's just like a spider crawled in and it's going off. And this is true about lots of our emotions. There's an evolutionary mismatch because our society, our culture has evolved much more quickly than our brain wiring has. And so for that reason, like when your kid is upset because you got the orange mac and cheese instead of the white mac and cheese, and you feel guilty because they're upset, that's a misfiring of guilt, right? You haven't caused harm. It just feels like you have, because we're wired to react when our kids are upset. And so what's important there is to recognize that sometimes guilt is useful. So we don't want to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. We need guilt because it is an important cue. Like if I haven't put my kids to bed all week, I kind of want that guilt to wake me up and say, I need to say no to the next work request I get so that I can show up and really connect with my kids. I need guilt to sort of wake me up to that fact. But what I want to do is to be able to be discerning about when to pay attention to guilt and let it drive my choices versus when I need to sort of notice it and say, you know what, that's not so useful. So in the mac and cheese case, guilt is not so useful. So the steps are to notice guilt, so to pause, to experience guilt, and to get curious. Is this guilt useful for me? Or is it kind of a hangover effect of evolution and not that serviceable? And one thing I'll add to this is that in modern parenting life, where we're constantly cued to try to make our kids happy and try to save them from embarrassment or failure, guilt can actually be problematic, because what it causes us to do is to step in ways that interfere with our children's developmental progress. So for example, if I feel guilty because my kid forgot their homework and I had to go to work and I wasn't able to bring it to them, and I tell my client, oh shoot, I have to cancel because my kid has a need, and I bring the homework to them, now I've actually stopped a difficult experience for my kid from being a learning experience, right? So sometimes that guilt, as well-intentioned as it is interfering with our kids' opportunities to experience discomfort and grow from those discomforts. And so we need to really be thoughtful about how often and in which situations we allow guilt to drive our parenting choices in particular. And I would argue that the same thing goes for work too, because, particularly women are sort of taught to feel guilty and responsible. And oftentimes that guilt actually interferes with the appropriate delegation of tasks. And so again, I think it's really like the pausing, the noticing, and the getting curious of like, how useful is the guilt versus how much is it kind of this hangover effect, but actually not quite serviceable in this context.
Ben, I know you have a question.
I do. Yael, what advice do you have for leaders, right? I've got a young administrative team. They've got families. I've got 4 kids. I've got staff members in all phases of life. But what advice do you have for me as a leader to make sure that I'm sending the right signals to the people that I work with, to make sure that they know that I want this for them?
Yeah.
Good.
I love that question. And I feel like probably the fact that you just asked that question means that you're very supportive of the fact that people have full lives. So, I think one thing is just to sort of make clear to the people that you work with and who work for you that you have the understanding that the fact that they have full lives is good for their jobs, it's good for their families, and that there's like a receptiveness to the fact that people have multiple facets of their life, that's something that's welcome. I remember actually, if a lot of the parents in the audience might be familiar with Emily Oster, who's a terrific writer, and I love her work, but she, after one of her books came out, had this movement, #parenting in the open, and I just loved it. It's sort of this idea that we can bring sort of parts of our family lives into the workspace, just as we can bring parts of our work lives into the family space. The second thing that I really advocate is running focus groups, because I think sometimes workspaces recognize that there are ways that we can support our working family members more effectively, but we're not exactly sure what it is. And because workspaces really differ, and because, you might have a young set of employees at this point, but they may age out, or you might have diversity that other workplaces don't. So I think actually inviting people to have conversations in small groups and talk about like what kinds of policies or flexibility or support systems or conversations need to be happening to support people. What are the needs, in other words? And of course, not everything is possible, but often once we recognize that there is a need, again, the fact that you're asking suggests that you're really interested in trying to find ways that there really are accommodations that can be made. But first we got to find out what the needs are. And I guess the final thing that I really think is important kind of goes to the idea of psychological detachment. I think that there is a temptation to lean too hard into flexibility and to say, well, you can leave whenever and then just do your work from home. And I think really encouraging people to have like a time out from work, whether it's like the dinner time, like, 5 to 8 when the kids are home and awake, and not to sign back on, but to actually have a workplace policy about that, to really foster that turning off. Because again, it helps our employees come back, it reduces turnover, it reduces burnout. So even though in theory you're like losing some of the work time and flexibility, it actually protects people's longevity in the workspace. So those are a couple ideas that I think can be quite helpful.
Thank you. You've got a question here about subtracting physical stuff, clutter in our lives, advice on managing our homes. Is it about spend more time with the kids, get the clutter out of our lives? What do you have to say?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. And I would say it's probably going to depend on different people's values. I think that clutter it's sort of like the nature of the game. Clutter happens. And so I think how we deal with it really depends on our circumstances. I have practices that are very deliberate because my life gets fit. Like I have a lot of roles. I have 3 kids. I am busy all the time, and things just build up. So for example, I'll just tell you about like a literal clutter practice that I have, which is that my kids and I drive this. They accommodate me somewhat willingly, but every season we go through their closets and just tidy up their drawers and get rid of stuff. And inevitably, like as the season goes on, like their drawers are a mess, but like once a season, we sort of clean everything out and start fresh. And I think practices like that, making them habitual, recognizing that it doesn't happen automatically, that we have to foster habits on a regular basis so that we can prevent the clutter from just growing, because that's what it will just grow. Like clutter in our schedules, in our closets, in our to-do lists will grow if we don't manage it. And again, it's sort of the biggest trick here is to recognize that subtraction does not happen automatically, that it needs to happen with effort. And the more that we can build deliberate practices and habits around it, the more that we can help that to happen. And when it comes to mindful parenting, I think this is a great question, because sometimes what the temptation to do is to like clear out space in your calendar. And then what we find ourselves doing is like making a play date or, signing up for a class because now we have a pocket in our calendar. And that becomes a missed opportunity in my mind, because I think we all know, at least at a theoretical level, that what our kids need is like time to just be, like where they don't have an enrichment activity where they have to be doing or performing or getting enriched, that they can just kind of hang. And like, this is like, feels like a wild concept to many of our young kids, but like they can even do it off of a screen, right? You can hang with your kids in the living room and play a board game or just chat or listen to music. And carving out time that doesn't have any activities, where you're just around, and Jerica, as you said, like in a mindful way, is such a beautiful thing. And it's so basic, but it's so hard in our modern life to prioritize it. But I think there's such a value in subtracting and leaving pockets of time open where that is what you do. Like, what you do is not much at all. You just be, you be together. And again, I think that that can be a really challenging objective to try to achieve in today's modern life, but it's a really beautiful one. And your kids may balk at it at first, but I highly recommend it. It's quite fun.
You know, this afternoon we talked about how important it is to help ourselves make the shift from one role to the next. Can you just that was so great. And you know, I'm taking away so much about how being in the moment with your child is really everything, and not about the amount of time, but being fully present in that moment. But what you do to shift from these different roles, what works for you?
Yeah, so what I talked about earlier today was a practice called micro rituals. And what we know from social science is that when we do these little rituals, and I always give the example, like when we say hello, it sort of wakes us up of like, oh, now I'm going to be engaging with somebody and sort of entering into some kind of a relationship or exchange with a new person. And when we say goodbye, we turn ourselves off and we sort of exit the exchange. So those little rituals, those scripts, are cues to our mind and our body to enter into certain kinds of ways of being. And we can do this in very deliberate ways as we're making role transition. So for example, and I always share my micro rituals of switching from one role to another, but after I drop my kids off and I'm switching into my parenting role. And if you'll notice, I work from home a lot of the time. I do have a private practice office, but I do a lot of my writing and other work from home. And so it's very easy for my roles to kind of mush together. But that makes it hard for me to be fully present in my work role because I'm half in parenting mode. And it makes it hard for me to step into parenting mode because my workspace is right here too. So these micro rituals help me to more fully flip into one role and out of the other, and then back again. So when I drop my kids off and I come home and I'm ready to start my day, what I do is I very deliberately get myself a hot mug of coffee or tea, depending on what time of day it is, and kind of savor the aroma and feel the heat. And I don't do it for it's like a few seconds really, but it's sort of an opportunity to say, okay, now's the time to transition. And I actually at the start of my day also do a 3-minute meditation, which helps me to transition. Like now I'm starting my day and it's only 3 minutes, but it's very deliberate. The first minute is just to come into my body. The second minute, I allow my mind to kind of free flow into all the things that I want to get done for the day, because that helps me to kind of get focused of like, what is it that I'm planning to do? And that really cues my body. And the third minute is a gratitude exercise of like what I'm grateful for, because that helps me to feel more positive, which helps to set a better way of being for whatever it is that I want to get done. It's much harder to do work if I'm grumpy. So the gratitude kind of helps me flip into that more positive mindset. When I'm switching from my work role into my parenting role, it's even easier and more simple, which is just that I hug my kids because they are still small and sweet and they smell good, and their little arms around me is just like the best way to fully transition from my work self into my parenting self. Now, I'm sure that as they age, I will need to come up with something different, but for now it works pretty well. So I think generating those tiny little rituals, and again, they don't have to take very long, but once we have them practiced and our body and our mind knows like this is my cue to go from this role to that role, it's this really nice way to sort of push yourself into being very mindful and present in whatever role you're about to step into.
I'm writing that down feverishly because I want to remember every word of it.
Oh,
But
thank you.
you know, the hugging your kids, we always conclude with this comment, now let's go hug the kids. So that's a perfect place to stop. Can't wait to have you back on this new book about relationships between partners. Let's talk about that in the future. Okay,
I
thank
would
you.
love that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. What an honor. Thank you.
Always a pleasure. Have a good evening, everyone. Thanks, Ben. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ben.
Yael, I always learn so much from you. I so appreciate. Thank you so much. I want to ask you a question very quickly before we get to anything else about this new book about the marital arena. Because so much of this also has to do with that. Give us a takeaway from what's upcoming for those of us that are overwhelmed in dealing with our partners.
Well, I will say that there is an entire chapter dedicated in my book to marital life, to really just generally relationship life. I talk a lot about marriage, but a lot of the things that I talk about are really would pertain to relationships between colleagues and relationship with friends and also relationship with kids. That chapter talks a lot about how we tend, when we're very stressed out, to create stories in our minds about often our partners as villain, and often there's a lot more complexity than our storyline offers. And so to be able to unhook from those stories and get into the nuance and learn how to communicate more clearly and more deliberately with the people that we are in close relationship with is important. Another thing to think about too, when we have very busy lives, is the habits that just very naturally grow in our marriage, in our partnerships, because our kids are very demanding, our work often has deadlines, and what falls to the bottom of the priority list is our partnerships. And there are lots of ways that that makes perfect sense, but to be very careful about how we allow ourselves to develop behavioral habits in relational life can be the difference between a relationship that thrives and one that really struggles. The next book is more specifically about communication and specifically about how we understand and misunderstand one another, because there's a whole host of ways that communication unfolds interpersonally, but that understanding is really an inside job that can get hijacked by the cognitive biases and the emotional processes that happen. And there's a really fascinating science to this that I'm really excited to dive into. So that's kind of what's up next for me.
Okay, we need to know about that. We'll be back to talk about that. Here's a question. What can we actively do besides put away the phones, computers, to make the mindset shift between work and home?
I love this question. One of my favorite practical strategies is what are called micro rituals. So just as, when you say goodbye or hello to somebody, it's sort of that script cues your mind of like, now we're departing or now we're entering into engagement with one another. We can actually create micro rituals to help us transition. And when we do that, when we create these little rituals, it actually helps cue our mind and our body to transition more fully and effectively. So for example, when I start my workday, I've dropped off my kids and I come home, I have a couple of micro rituals. And one is that I make myself a cup of something hot and try to do it in a pretty deliberate way. It doesn't take a lot of time, but it's more about kind of showing up fully and mindfully. And the next thing I do, and I literally do this, is I do a 3-minute meditation because that's about all I have time for. And the first minute, I try to just come into my body. In the second minute, I allow myself to think about what I'm going to get done in my workday that day. Sort of allow myself to kind of free think about my to-do list. And then the third minute, I do a gratitude minute. And that's my transition ritual. And it really helps me to kind of show up and really hit the ground running. Because of the practice, my body and my mind know now it's time to get to work. The transition that I have to transition from work to parenting is much simpler. I just hug my kids because they're still sweet and delicious. And that hug is my cue, body and mind. Now we are putting away the work self and we are showing up in full mode to parenting. And it is a little bit like acceptance, which is like, it's not one and done. Sometimes you have to kind of keep doing those things because our minds, they wander, right? They wander to what we're not doing. And so it's a little like a meditation practice if you want to keep coming back to it. But those very concrete micro rituals can help to kind of cue you. Now's the time to step into this role and away from that role. Now's the time to exchange and transition from one to the other. And so I think it's sort of like this very simple thing that we can do. It doesn't have to take a lot of time, but it can offer this very tidy boundary between one role to another. And I will say that that is a particular use when all of your roles exist in the same space. I don't know if you can tell, but I actually do a lot of work from home. I have a private practice office, but my writing I do from home. And so without those micro rituals, it can kind of feel like I'm sort of working and I'm sort of my mother self. But those micro rituals help my brain create a boundary that helps me to say, okay, now I'm not mother self. I'm going to get some stuff done. And it really helps my whole self focus a bit more on what it is that I'm trying to focus on for that chunk of time.
I'm seeing that the gratitude piece is very big in this, and we hear this from everyone. And so I think about how you're asking us about a mind shift, and to appreciate that we have this time away from job A to go to the home job, and vice versa, and the skills that we can cross reference here between these two. My question for you is about, you know, if someone said that scrolling is relaxing for them, you know, what's your response to that? We know that it can be a total waste of time, but I've heard that said, this helps me relax. What's your comment about
I think it's sort of like doing it intentionally, as long as it's value aligned, I think is great. But lots of healthy things are great in certain amounts, right? Watching a Netflix show, great for an hour, probably less healthy if you're doing it all night. Dessert, great if you have 1 or 2 cookies, less healthy if you eat the entire package. So I think for those kinds of sort of indulgences or enjoyable experiences, it's all about showing up mindfully. And actually, when we show up mindfully, the one cookie is going to be more satisfying. The one Netflix show is going to be more fulfilling. The 20 minutes that we scroll is going to be scratch that itch of just like, I need to kind of turn off for a little bit. So I think that the trick there is to actually do the indulgent thing and show up and let go of the guilt. Like, you're giving yourself permission to just have an indulgence, and you're going to kind of keep it a little bit structured and boundaried so that it doesn't become unhealthy. And that way it really does serve this role of helping to recharge you. I think we all need that. I mean, I know people really vary in sort of how they think about screen use for their kids, but I think we can even think about that for our kids. And that's something that I teach my own children, is that they're allowed, after a long day, and they have long days, right? Their days are exhausting for them. So they're allowed to come home and do a half hour or 45 minutes of screens. And that remains okay as long as they have figured out like how to turn it off at the end of that time and get to other things like their homework or family dinner time. And so long as they can manage that time, use it wisely, and then transition to something else, then it becomes a healthy part of their life that they get to continue to hold on to as something that they can look forward to at the end of a long day.
You're reminding me about when we had some folks come from the Fred Rogers Institute, and really their message was about how it's that moment with your child. It's not about the number of moments, but it's being fully present when you are with that child. That's what you're saying, right?
100%. And I think that we often, especially moms, because the guilt is so pervasive, and I think culturally, it's just like such a message that we get everywhere of like, good parents are always observant and good parents show up for all the things. And that, to me, I think is an incorrect message. I think that it is helpful for us to absent ourselves because it gives our kids some independence. It gives them opportunities to attach to other caregivers. It gives them an opportunity to make a mistake and save themselves. And when we do show up, if we can do it in a very present, full, mindful way, that helps them to know that we're really there. Like, when we're there, we're there. And when we're not, we're probably doing something else, and we'll come back when we're ready and we'll be fully present. So I think it's like, the danger is to kind of always be half on and half off, because that's very unsatisfying for our kids. If we're there, but we're distracted by all of our work obligations or the whatever stressors are on our mind. So what we want to do is we want to be more often mindfully present or fully away, so that when we return, we can be more mindfully present. And again, I said this earlier, I think recognizing the value of that helps us manage the guilt a lot more, right? That guilt of like, but what if I'm not there enough for my kids? Well, actually, if you're not there, but you're like fully gone, and then you can come back in a very wholehearted way, that's actually much better for your kids than if you're around all the time, but you're half distracted all of that time.
Right. And I think about the benefits of their child being, you talked about this, more independent when we're not there to, you know, help them blow their nose or whatever it might be, right? Jessica, I know you want to say something as we say goodbye here.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you very much. And basically, you made me think a lot resonated with me as a mom of 3 children and principal of a comprehensive high school. And it just makes me want to think about what strategies and advice that you might have for leaders in the workplace to think about how can we foster environments and cultures within our teams that really create that work family enrichment mentality. And so I'm going to do a lot of thinking about that. I know we're about to wrap up, but if you have any quick thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, I think just recognizing that our roles help each other out is a real pivot for a lot of workplaces. And maybe this is less true in school settings, but for a lot of workplaces, it's sort of like we don't want the whiff of family in the workplace, but actually recognizing that people who have family roles tend to have more interpersonal skills and certain perspectives that are quite beneficial. And to recognize that when our employees go into their family lives and we give them full permission to leave and not sort of be on the hook to respond to messages, that allows them to get a break so that they can come back recharged, I think is also an important message for workplaces. So those are 2 of the major tips that I tend to give for like the workplace mentality. But I think that one thing that I'm a huge advocate of is like focus groups. I think it's really interesting and really varies from workplace to workplace what working parents need more of. And so I think running focus groups is something that I'm a huge advocate of, to get the people that work there to give very specific feedback about what kinds of shifts in workplace policy would be helpful. Because I think sometimes we don't really know, we sort of think we know, but it's so idiosyncratic.
Yeah,
That's great.
Yeah.
Really good point. As we say goodbye here, and you talked about our core needs for agency, for competency, for connection. Aren't those so vital for our children as well?
Yes.
Great reminder that how this has to be really a top priority goal for us with our children.
Yes, absolutely.
We always end with a hug the children, but at noon we can't do that. So those of you that are here, let everyone know we'll be back at 7 p.m. Central Time, and we'll be talking about this topic, and we'll be learning more, because each time I listen to you, I learn more, and I'm so grateful. Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you
Thanks,
both. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. What an honor. I really appreciate it.
Love seeing you. Take care, everyone.